More protests are set for Friday night in Iran, even as the government promises a harsh crackdown. Authorities in Iran have already cut internet service in response to the protests, making it difficult to gauge the scale of the unrest and the potential violence of the government response. Here to discuss, Sarakshi Rai, Deputy Managing Editor here at The Hill. Hey, Sarakshi. So it is a bit hard to get information out of Iran right now, considering these blackouts of the internet, but the protests do appear to be spreading. What can you tell us about the protests that are planned for Friday and how this connects to the larger movement of protests that we've been seeing that have been ongoing?
That's right, Drew. What we're seeing is that these protests are spreading despite this communications blackout that currently is ongoing in Iran. Now, Iran has signaled that, the security forces are going to crack down on protesters. And this is a direct challenge, really, to President Donald Trump's pledge to support those who are peacefully demonstrating. We know the death toll so far has risen to at least 50. It's unclear whether this toll is set to rise, but we know that the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, has dismissed Trump's claim, saying that, Trump is having hands stained with the blood of Iranians. Even though the supporters, shouted death to America in the footage that was aired by the Iranian state TV, we know that the protesters are gathering in Tehran. They are really, demonstrating that they want this regime to end. They are, going out there to protest everything that's ongoing in Iran as well. And now we also know that Iran's judiciary chief has said that the punishment for these protesters will be decisive, maximum, and without any legal leniency. And so far, there's really been no response from Washington, despite Trump's pledge to really crack down on Iran and conduct strikes on Iran if they were to directly go out of protesters. Now, we know that, Iran tried to cut off the internet services. So there's no phone calls going in, no online videos, but they're still managing to get around this communications blockade. But really, the Iranian media and state media are really characterizing these protesters as terrorist agents of the United States and Israel. So we're seeing these demonstrations continue despite the fact that the Iranian regime is cracking down on these protesters. True.
We've seen protests like this before. Is this response from the Iranian government typical to what usually happens in these type of circumstances, or is this been taken to a different level?
We've seen these protests really kind of start to swell up since December 28th of last year, and they've continued. What we also know is the former crown prince, Reza Pahlavi, whose father, let's not forget, fled Iran just before the country's 1979 Islamic revolution. He called for protests on Thursday night, and he's called for these demonstrations to continue on Friday as well. And so really, these demonstrators have also kind of included, slogans in support of the Shah, which we know in Iran has, a death sentence if they do that. But we also know that there's a lot of anger that these protesters have that is fueling these, protests that began over Iran's failing economy. So, what we do know is that the tide of protest really turned when the former crown prince Reza Pahlavi really called for the protesters to gather. But really, it's unclear, how long this is going to continue for and how hard the regime is going to crack down on these protesters and what the consequences for them will be. We know, the state has vowed very harsh responses, so they are really going out there to protest despite the fact that they might have a death sentence levied on them if they are arrested at these protests. True.
Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei put out a series of tweets today, and this one caught my eye. He said, "All should know that the Islamic Republic of Iran, that was established with the sacrifice of several hundred thousand honorable people, won't back down in the face of those causing destruction." Won't back down. As you mentioned, the head of Iran's judiciary said the treatment of demonstrators would be decisive, maximum, and without any legal leniency. Meanwhile, you mentioned earlier, you have President Trump promising to protect protesters. What is the president saying about how the U.S. would respond if we see widespread violence amid this government crackdown?
So it's unclear exactly how the US plans on responding, despite the president saying that, if the Iranian regime goes after the peaceful demonstrators, he will have some kind of a response. But it remains unclear, how he plans on doing that. But of course, in the wake of the strikes in Venezuela, his threat is not taken lightly. So, will it be a strike that he conducts in Iran? Will it be, something else that he does? It's still unclear what the president means by that when he says that he's vowing a response. But what we do know is that he did warn that if Tehran violently kills peaceful protesters, then America will come to their rescue. And we also know European leaders have voiced their support for the protesters, backing the president's statement as well, saying that they will also have a response if Iran goes after these protesters. So, right now, it's still unclear how exactly they plan on responding, but he has vowed some kind of response, Drew.
President Trump also suggested that the Ayatollah might be looking to flee the country. What do we know about that?
That's right. He did mention that the Ayatollah might be looking at fleeing the country and might be looking at ways to escape Iran, but it's unclear whether that is exactly what the Ayatollah is planning. We do know that in the recent days, the former Crown Prince, Reza Pahlavi, he wrote an opinion piece for the Washington Post. He's called on demonstrators to gather on Thursday and Friday, and that has really given some of these demonstrators the support that they needed. They've also included cries of support for the Shah, but it's still right now unclear, whether or not, Reza Pahlavi is planning to return to the country at all. He's been in exile since that revolution in 1979 when his father fled. And also Trump has not said whether or not he'll meet with Reza Pahlavi. So essentially right now, there's still a lot of details that are unclear because of the communications blackout in the country. But the Iranian supreme leader so far not showing signs of backing down against these protesters, and his regime really saying that they are going to go after these protesters in a very decisive manner, and they will have to face very, very harsh consequences, which could include a death sentence, True.
All right, a developing story that we will continue to follow, but for now, we'll leave it at that. Sarakshi Rai, thanks so much for your time.